Welcome back to Train Signal Citrix XenApp Training. You're watching the Delegated Administration and Configuration Logging lesson. Alright, this is going to be a relatively short lesson as well, but it's going to be packed with information. What we're going to cover in this lesson is how you can grant delegated administration, or in other words, how you can do role-based access to the delivery services console and different objects within your farm. So typically you don't want everybody to have full access to the farm. You want to limit that to one or two of your administrators or the group of Citrix administrators that you have, depending on the size of the Citrix infrastructure. But you might necessarily want to give, for example, your boss access to see what's going on because your boss is one of those bosses that requires micromanagement, for example. So in that case, you can give your boss some kind of limited access to the delivery services console to view things in your Citrix farm. You can also give limited control to the help desk to be able to publish applications or to do certain things like shadow users, so on and so forth. So we're going to cover all of that in different types of role-based administrative access that you can grant to the farm. We're also going to talk about configuration logging. Configuration logging is a very helpful and useful tool within the Citrix farm because it tracks every change that is made and it logs that change into a database against which you can then run reports and figure out who made the change, when the change was made, etc. We're going to talk about how you can configure the configuration logging settings and what different types of settings you can have. So the first thing we're going to start off with is role-based administrative access. So when you're inside the farm, and I'll show you this once we get into the demonstration portion of this lesson, you can create several administrative accounts that can log on to the Citrix farm. Now by default there are three roles or three privileges levels, if I can call them, that you can grant these particular administrative accounts. You can have view only, which means they'll have access to the entire farm. They can do they can only see what's going on. They can see the settings, but they can't manipulate them. Full administrator is pretty self-explanatory. They have access to everything. They can manipulate everything. And then there's custom. Custom is when you don't want to give them full administrative, but view only is too restrictive. You custom create a role, a set of privileges that they can change. So for example, they can shadow or they can modify the settings of a particular server, etc., etc. So you customize that role depending on the group that's trying to gain access to your Citrix farm. We're going to talk about how you disable an administrative account. Maybe you're creating an administrative account for a new engineer that you've hired or that's joining the group that hasn't joined yet. You can create the account ahead of time but disable it. Maybe one or more of your particular administrators is on leave, or you have a consultant that comes in. You can create an administrative account that can be disabled after they're gone or when they're not there. So there's all sorts of things why you can use a disabled administrative account. We're going to talk about folder permissions. So within the Citrix farm, you're able to create folders. Under these folders, you can put servers, you can put applications, you can put content, and then you can apply permissions against these folders. So instead of having just access to the whole farm, you can say, I'm only granting you access to a particular folder, and inside that particular folder, you can manipulate or add applications or change the settings of a particular application, so on and so forth. Folder permissions are the same, but you can granularly grant access to the farm in that regards. So from a delegated administration perspective, there's one thing that is worth noting here, or is worth noting here. If you're giving full access to a child folder, make sure the user account that you're giving access to has at least view privileges onto the parent folder. So if they can't see the parent folder, then they won't be able to see any of the child folders underneath, and regardless of what permissions you give them. So that is very important to note, that at some point you need to give at least view permissions to the parent folder if you're granting them more access to any child folders. The configuration logging database, as we've spoke about earlier, it's a mechanism by which you can log all of the different tasks that are made inside of your Citrix farm. So for example, you can log who made the change, the date and time the change was made, so the timestamp, the object against which the change was made. So was it the servers, was it the applications, was it content, where was the change made? Was the change successful or was the change a failure? Did it, were you able to implement the change? Were you able to execute or not? Now, when we get into the demonstration, I'll show you how you can use the GUI in order to generate that log report But for those of you that like command line, or if you're trying to script this, or if you want to run it on an interval basis, the command to run this report is in bold. So you can see you can do get-ctx, and you'll go through the whole command in order to generate that if you want to do it on a regular basis. The configuration logging database, you can have a SQL Server 2005 or 2008. Oracle's also supported from a configuration database standpoint. Now, I'll show you these when we get into the demo portion as well, but some of the configuration settings, some of the configuration logging settings that you can do, you can log administrative tasks to the configuration database. So anything that the administrator will do, those tasks are logged to the database. So there's a checkbox where you'll be able to do that. And you can also allow changes to the farm when logging database is disconnected. So this is basically, if the logging database isn't available, do you want to allow changes to be made to the farm? If you disable this, then when the logging database isn't there, they can't make these changes. This is important due to some regulatory laws that you might be under. If you're trying to track everything that happens, if you need some kind of a change control policy in place where you're not allowing anyone, then this would be disabled. Where if the configuration logging database isn't there, changes should not be made to the farm. This gives you a way of tracking certain things. Now, again, depending on your environment, your enterprise, your organization, and the criticality of the issue, this might be your friend, or it might be a stumbling block against resolving a critical issue that stops the business from moving forward. So again, use good judgment, use a balance here of what you should and you should not allow, and how hard you want to enforce certain things. Require administrators to enter database credentials before clearing the log. This is important because if you don't require them to enter the credentials, then administrators can clear the configuration logging database and you have no way of tracking that. So you have to be very, very careful with this permission, because it technically, if they've done something wrong and they're trying to cover their tracks, they can delete the logs and you have no way of figuring out what happens. So it's all about checks and balances. It's all about putting in place permissions that are not strong enough where you're stopping someone from addressing issues when they arise, but also take into account that you need that change control, you need that accountability, you need that log in order for you to hold people accountable and figure out what happened. So let's go ahead and jump to the demonstration portion of this lesson and see how we configure all of these things. We're back in the Citrix Delivery Services console, and as you can see, I've expanded XenApp and we have the farm highlighted here. So if I expand our farm, all of the objects under our farm will display. And the first thing you'll notice is administrators. So during the installation of XenApp, the first administrator that was added as a farm administrator was the user that we were using to install Citrix XenApp with. And as you'll notice, it's a domain administrator. It has full admin privileges. Now, if you wanted to add another account as a farm administrator or as some other user that can access the Citrix farm, you can right-click on the administrator's node, and we're going to click on Add Administrator. And now there's two ways for you to select or browse for users. You can do Citrix User Selector, or if you select Operating System User Selector, this just basically points to the local operating system, the local directory on the XenApp server, which would allow you to select local users and groups. For my purposes, I'm going to select Citrix User Selector, which allows me to connect to the domain, and we're going to click on Add. Now, of course, there's a checkbox here to add the local administrators. You can feel free to do that if you wanted to. This is local administrators to the box, of course. Now, if I click on Add here, and I go into Encom, it'll ask me to authenticate against the domain. Once you have authenticated, I've already pre-created an organizational unit called Citrix. Under Citrix, I have another organizational unit called Users. Under Users, I have several different groups. Now, of course, if you wanted to add users only, not groups, you can click on Show Users and you'll have any configured users that you have in there. I would strongly recommend the use of Active Directory groups rather than particular users, because that makes disabling or removing users or adding users, it makes it based on group, and you can do it from Active Directory. That way you don't have to mess around with these roles after you've created them. So as you'll notice, I have a couple different roles here. I have an Active Directory group that I've created specifically for anyone I want to give read-only permissions. That could be my manager, that could be auditors, whoever I want to be able to grant read-only permissions into my farm. I'll add them to the Citrix-read-only group, And as we're going to go through and grant them the permissions, the only thing they'll be able to do here is basically read-only access to the farm. So if I click next, this is where you can configure what type of access you're giving to these users. So in my case, we're giving them view-only access. If you wanted to create this account but not enable it right away, you can select disable. We're going to click finish, and bada bing bada boom. It's as simple as easy as that. Now if we wanted to create a custom group, for example, for our help desk, you don't want to give them view only, but you also don't want to give them simply full administrator, because that's a little dangerous. What we're going to do is go into Encom here, authenticate one more time. We're going to select that group, Citrix Help Desk, click on next, and now we're going to create custom. Once you create custom, the wizard will add an extra step. So now you have the ability, you have all of the objects here that are configured or that are available for you to configure, and you can pick and choose what you want to give these users, what you want to give this group access to. So at the farm level, these are what you have the ability to grant them access to doing or not. So you can do, if you give them edit all objects, all other farm settings, that's an extensive administrative function that you probably don't want to do. So most of these functions I would probably keep disabled. For example, you can come here to applications and you can give them the ability to publish applications, and this will enable both of these options. So you can uncheck whatever you don't need to. And under servers, for example, you can give them access to the sessions. You can give them access to terminate processes if they need to. Under the sessions, if you want to get very granular, they can connect sessions, they can disconnect, they can log off, they can reset, send messages. All of these are typically help desk functions that users should have access to. They shouldn't have access to policies, load balancing, or load evaluators. You might want to give them access to printer management, etc., etc. For now, just for the purposes of this demonstration, let's assume I was just satisfied with the level of granularity that I've given them. I'm going to click on finish, and voila. Now you've created these groups. You've added a group and you've given that group a role of permissions, a set of privileges that they can or cannot do within your Citrix farm. Now if we wanted to do delegated access, if we wanted to get a little more granular with what we're giving them access to, and we're trying to organize things, so under servers, let's assume you had a lot of servers here and you've started to organize these servers into folders. If you right click on the node here, you can create folders, and let's say you wanted to create a folder for CRM. If you create a folder for CRM and you check the box here, copy permissions from the parent folder, then this folder will inherit the permissions that the servers get. I'm just going to keep that one disabled, or I'm not going to check it for now. I'm just going to click OK. And moving servers into folders is very easy. You can select the XenApp server that you want, drag and drop it into the folder, and bada bing bada boom, it goes in there. Now in order for you to attach permissions on a particular folder, you can select CRM, right click, we're going to drag down to other tasks, and then we're going to select permissions. Now you'll notice the only two permissions that are added here are the administrator and read-only. Now when we were creating the Citrix Help Desk role, we didn't grant the help desk any type of privilege over the server's role. Now there's one of two things that you can do. You can either go back in and modify the role and give them access over servers, or as you can see here, you can add that particular farm administrator group. Once you've added that group, you'll see the view here is very helpful because it tells you what type of access this user has access to. What can this user do? You'll notice that they don't have any type of access over servers. Now if you click on OK, the change won't take. So let's go ahead and click OK just to demonstrate. And if I go back into CRM here, under permissions, it's gone. Now you can do two things again. You can either select it one more time, click OK, and you can edit that particular role over here from this, so you don't have to go to the other window basically and change it. The only caveat here is you can only change it to one of the default settings, so you won't be able to manipulate the permissions completely. So if you give it full administration, then you're making the Citrix Help Desk group full administrator over the farm. So I don't recommend that you make the change here. I would recommend you cancel and cancel out and go back into the administrators node, right click on Citrix Help Desk, drag down to Administrator Properties, select Permissions, and then you can choose Servers. And you'll notice that under Servers, the CRM folder has now shown up. So if you go under and select CRM and you give it basically full control over the CRM folder and click OK, will you be able to access CRM? The answer is, in order for you to access the CRM with full control, users still have to be able to see the servers folder. So here's what you did. You gave them access over the sessions, over the servers, and over published applications. What you need to do under the server, under the parent container, is give them at least view access. So under sessions, for the servers, you're going to give them view sessions. Under servers, you are going to give them view server information. So you're going to have to give them some access to the parent folder before they can see the child folder. So if I click on OK now, let's take a look at what happened under the servers folder here by going to other tasks, permissions again. So we now have it with these rights. These are the rights that I have here for the parent folder. Now if I go under CRM, click on Help Desk, voila. You'll notice that you have checkboxes over everything here. So this gives you an idea of how permissions work, and these permissions are the same whether you're doing it under servers or you're doing it under the applications container. It doesn't matter. The permissions work the same. So be wary of how you use the edit button here in order to grant access, because it only allows you to navigate between the three default roles, and it doesn't allow you to get very granular in terms of permissions on that particular folder. So if I click on cancel, this is pretty much how you give access, whether it's delegated access or role-based access into your Citrix farm. What I want to focus our attention on right now is moving to the configuration logging. We want to first enable configuration logging. We want to configure the database so it can accept configuration logging tasks and be able to store them. And then we're going to configure the settings of that configuration logging. So in order to do that, if you remember when we were talking about the Delivery Services Console in the Navigating Delivery Services Console lesson, we said that the only setting that's left that's available under the farm settings, by right-clicking the farm encom and dragging down to farm properties, the only setting that's left is configuration logging. So if you select configuration logging, right now it's disabled. What you want to do ahead of time is you want to make sure you've created a DSN, an ODBC connection to your SQL database. So you've created the configuration logging database on your SQL server. You've created a system DSN that already points to this configuration logging database. Once you've done that, you're going to come here and click on Configure Database. Once you've configured the database, is it a SQL server or an Oracle server? Where is this server located? In my case, it's just the server that we're working on, so I'm going to select localhost. If you're using your Windows credentials, I'm going to type in the domain first and then the user that I want to connect with. Once you've done that, you can click on Next. At this point, you want to choose the database. I'm going to scroll, and I've created a database called Configuration Logging, so I'm going to select that and click Next. This is important. So all of these are default information that you probably don't need to change, with the exception of use encryption. So if you keep use encryption yes, then when you go to the next screen here and you try to test the database will come back with an error message. So it's going to come back and say, look, my connection to your server was successful, but I'm having problems authenticating you with with SSL. So if you click on details, it'll give you this information that the connection was successful. However, you have an SSL error. And the reason for that SSL error is because I don't have SSL configured. I don't have any certificates here that are configured for this database. So I want to make sure that my IMA encryption here, or the use of encryption, is disabled. If in your environment the use of encryption internally is necessary, then you would have to install certificate on the server and make sure SSL is properly configured in order for the IMA encryption to take place. For me, I'm just going to keep use encryption no. Everything else I'm going to keep at the default. I'm going to click on Next here. These are settings that you can configure from a database perspective. What do you want your minimum pool size to be, your maximum pool size to be, the connection lifetime in terms of seconds, etc., etc. These, for the most part, should not be changed unless there's some kind of a performance issue or you need to tweak the connection to the database in one way or another. Click on Next here. If we test the connection to the database, it is now successful. This is a summary of the configurations. We're going to click on Finish. This is where you can configure the settings for the configuration logging. So if you select Log Administrative Tasks to Configuration Logging Database, obviously all the tasks that the users will make will be logged. Allow changes to the farm when logging database is disconnected. Based on your regulations, based on Sarbanes-Oxley, or whatever regulations you fall under, this might be a necessity or it might not be a necessity. In my case, I'm going to keep this disabled, but at least you know where it is if you want to enable it. Require administrators to enter database credentials before cleaning the log. I think this should be a given that the users can't just go in there and clean the database without putting in credentials of who made this particular change or who cleared the log of the database. Once you've configured it to your liking, we're going to click on OK. It's going to go through its thing, and voila, you now have a configuration logging database configured. If you click on History now, you'll notice that now I have more options under History as far as how I can get the log. So you can click on Get Log and it's going to generate that report for you. However, before you do that, you want to set the criteria, the filtering criteria before you can do that. Right now the filter is off, so I'm going to click on Set Filter, and you can configure the filters. You want the changes made in the last hour. You can select that last 24 hours, last 7 days. Let's do last 24 hours. You can do a custom date range if you want. You can run a report against the changes made by a specific administrator. You can select this option, browse for the specific administrator that you want. Let's do choose item here, and then you can just basically run through the database and find the administrator that you want to run this against. You can also select show only the changes made to specific items, so only changes made to the applications folder, only changes made to the servers folder, etc., etc. Or you can do a specific item and select it by browsing to it here. So once you've made these changes, you're going to click on OK. And when you're ready, you can click on Get Log. I'm probably going to get an empty log here. I haven't made any changes, but you get the general idea, the general picture. Once you click on Get Log, it's the equivalent of the command line that I showed you during the presentation, which would allow you to run the report manually through a command line interface if you're adding it into a script or anything like that. And that's it for this lesson. I hope this was good information. We're going to switch back to our presentation so that we can recap what we've learned. This was a relatively short lesson, so to speak, but we covered very, very good information here. So what did we go through? What did we cover in this lesson? We talked about role-based administrative access into the Citrix farm and the types of permissions that you can give the different administrators that you're granting access. We talked about the three that you have by default: view only, full administrator, and custom. And the fact that custom, you can disable or give users very granular access to certain items within your Citrix farm. We talked about folder permissions and how you can give permissions to certain folders that you're organizing your content or applications or your servers within. And we talked about the fact that if you're giving access to a child folder, you want to make sure that the same administrative account at least has view access to the parent folder before those permissions can take effect. Very, very important stuff. Then we moved on to the configuration logging. Configuration logging is a way for you to track what's going on within your Citrix farm, any changes that have been made, anything that happens, any manipulation of the Citrix farm gets logged to the configuration logging database. We went through and configured the logging database, went through some of the configuration logging settings, and we talked about all of those. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.